Women, they are strong, talented, and impactful. I myself can list many that I admire and I would categorize in strong, talented, and impactful. But that's only the beginning of a long list of women that I personally appreciate. In my own family, the women have been incredibly hard workers in various professional fields like business, education, management, but none ever ventured into the fields of manufacturing or industry. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's exactly what lures me toward the subject. Historically, women have had tremendous impacts on what it means to be working in manufacturing or industrial fields. Women have worked incredibly hard for the companies that employed them, but during times of mass production, like wartime, that work doubled, tripled sometimes even. But oftentimes this work was underpaid, underappreciated, and even led them into dangerous situations or gave them incurable diseases. Now, I know we've seen glamorized depictions of women working, especially those working in things like the war industry. I know we've all seen posters and photographs depicting the Rosie the Riveters or someone like that who is seen sporting a face of makeup, red lipstick, and clean work uniforms. Unfortunately, that picture that is often presented to us is not the one that is the truth. So, I want to talk about that. My goal for this podcast series is to educate my audience on women and their roles in industry, but more specifically, the war industry. I will be paying specific attention to 3 individual cases: matchmakers, dial painters, and munitions workers. These 3 fields in manufacturing and industry are entirely independent of one another because one sets the stage for the other 2 cases because it's prior to World War I, and the other 2 are during World War I. Throughout our conversation of these women and the cases, I will discuss the fields in which they worked, obviously, what their jobs were like, and even the lasting impacts those jobs had on their health. Now, before I continue any further into this conversation, I would like to review what the term industry means because I will be using it incredibly often throughout my series. So when I think of industry, I think of a set group of companies that specialize in similar business activities. More often than not, when we hear the term industry, we hear it referring to something having to do with manufacturing. Another meaning of industry that I found in one of my primary sources says that there are 3 things we can think of when we refer to women working in industry. To work in industry means you have the chance to earn a living, you can display your endurance, and you have the opportunity to join in the constructive upbuilding of a better order. Now, if you ask me, this just sounds like a job, but that's neither here nor there. That was from a worker's manual in 1938, but we're going to continue. Historically, many women have supported their families by working inside the residence, completing jobs like spinning, weaving, sewing textiles, woodworking, pottery, and other household arts like cooking, cleaning, caretaking, and more. But with the dawn of industrialization and the push towards factory-produced goods, women's work moved from the home to the factories and from homemaking to manufacturing. Staying home and working inside the home was no longer an option, nor was it cheap. Because the push towards industrialization, the costs of living became higher, and those factory-produced goods cost more. So men and women had to move outside the home to work. So basically, everyone became a breadwinner. The cases I'm covering throughout my podcast series covers both women working in industry and women working in the war industry, as I said earlier. During times of peace and war, women's work has always been essential to a nation. It was actually during the war that women showed up and showed their nations that they were willing and able to take over the positions that men had left open, because military necessity took those men from their positions on the production lines, and spots needed to be filled due to the rising amounts of war supply orders. So, those who were not called to war, like women or men who were uneligible for military service, got called to work. For our podcast series, we're specifically going to be focusing on the women being called to work and not the other men. Women in companies did not set out to create new positions, but they actually just wanted to fill open positions because it was a time of emergency. I also should mention that women did not just start working in industry right at the rise of industrialization, but they steadily grew in the field until wartime, and that's when the workforce of women in industry doubled. Like I said, I'll be talking about a case of matchmakers, or the match girls as I refer to them as. And that was prior to the war, and it was an industrial field. So when the wars began, a list was created compiling all the jobs, including job descriptions, of the occupations that women could fill in for, because as I said, we weren't just creating new positions for them to fill. It should also be noted that women were considered to be welcome replacements, as they were eager and loyal workers. But also, women in the workplace were paid about half the amount of what men made early on in the war, even though they did the same jobs. So that was also cheap labor. In later sources I used from 1919 in Great Britain, it was said that women should be making the same wages as men since they were doing the same jobs, and we don't see that until later. So to explain just how much of an impact women had on the war industry, during the war period, during the time period between 1900 and 1930, census data reported that women overrepresented men in mechanical and manufacturing, factory, and industry positions. That's amazing. So when women entered the war industry, or just industry, they weren't given really any training for the positions that they were set to fill, especially for the war industry, because there was no time to train, they needed workers. Industrial work itself is repetitious, and workers often completed the same tasks over and over again all day long. But women especially received the brunt of the repetitive jobs when they entered the industry. While much of the repetitive work that women completed was considered to be light work, the constant repetition of similar movements all day led to physical and mental damage. Heavier work sometimes is thrown in there for more variety, but those are not seen as ideal jobs for women. So again, in the Labor Review from 1919, Great Britain set working standards for women in industry, and among that was the type of work they should be doing. So they shouldn't be lifting heavier than 25 pounds, they shouldn't be constantly standing, they should not operate heavy machinery, they shouldn't be exposed to toxic fumes or chemicals without precautions in place. As we will find out later, all of these warnings weren't always quite heeded. So, as I'm sure you know, the conditions in which we work affect how we work, both physically and mentally. Sometimes we can be harmed by our jobs and have no idea what's occurring at all. So, like I mentioned, we're not supposed to have toxic fumes or dusts, but workplace conditions affecting women or workers in general were lighting, heating, ventilation, noise, seating, sanitation, and the clearing of air. Having sufficient circulation, ventilation, and elimination systems in place is of primary importance when you work in a factory, because as we learn later, harmful fumes and dusts that were breathed in led to deadly results. Same thing with sanitation and not being able to wash your hands properly. So, later on in the war, to combat the physical effects of breathing in harmful chemicals, dust, and residues, methods like reduction in substances inhaled, substitution of chemicals, and compensation laws or labor laws and compensation for hazardous work were later implemented. But that was for World War II. So, as I discussed, World War I and prior to that, we're not going to have much regulation. But because of all these regulations being put into place, people were saying, well, why should we let women do this work anyways? But that wouldn't be economically smart to release all those workers from their production line. So women did the work. So I've reviewed a lot of information to introduce you to the subjects that we'll be hearing in later episodes. And I think I've detailed enough introductory material that you'll be able to hold on tight when we get into episodes next. So, I just want you to remember, throughout the series, I plan to discuss some of the fields in which women worked, what their jobs were like, and those lasting impacts their jobs had on their health. Now, next up in episode 2, I will be covering the dark yet flaming story of women who worked as matchmakers prior to World War I and the horrible necrotic truths their stories have left behind. Stay tuned.